Well, good afternoon, everybody who's online today. This is the Airmic Survey 2018 webinar, and I'm Julia Graham, and for those of you who don't know me, Deputy CEO, and I head up the technical programme at Airmic. What I'd like to do today is to share with you some insights into the survey this year. I'm also going to sort of cast our minds back a little bit to what we did in 2015 and then briefly in 2017 on surveys. And then I also want to talk very, very briefly about the research we did with Roads to Revolution, which is our third in the trilogy of our research projects on resilience. So those of you who have been around long enough or have had the opportunity to look at our website will notice that in 2011 we issued a piece of research called Roads to Ruin. In 2014 we issued a piece of research called Roads to Resilience, and concurrently with the publication of our survey this year at the annual conference, we issued the third in this piece of work called Roads to Revolution. And the reason I'm going to mention particularly Roads to Revolution is that a lot of what we see in the survey is also reflected in that research. So to an extent, the pieces of work segue with one another. So this is going to be a focus on the survey, but I think it would be inappropriate not just to cross-reference some relevant points to the Roads to Revolution research as well. So we're going to take about half an hour to go through this. If you do have any questions that you would like to ask, then please do ask them online. Very happy to answer any questions as we go through the process. If you don't want to do that, you want to save them to the end, that's just as well, and that will work fine too. I'm joined in the Airmic office also this afternoon by Georgina Wainwright. And if you are too shy to come forward with questions, I absolutely know that Georgina is going to be relied upon to grill me as well. So either way, we're going to get some dialogue going in between us. So without further ado, I'd like those of you who've got the ability to do this to cast your minds back 3 years. It doesn't really seem very long ago, but in those 3 years, there have been some radical changes to the way that risk is perceived in the boardroom, to the way that risk is perceived by our members, and the way that Airmic is responding to the needs of our partners, our members, and others in the risk management community. And I find it really hard when I was preparing for today's webinar, and I look back at the pre-conference survey in 2015, just how much had changed in such a short period of time in terms of what we're focusing on and why. So I thought it might be a good idea just to use one slide from that pre-conference survey, which I think is a very nice one, which is up on the screen now. And it explains why Airmic have been concentrating on some of the subjects that we have for the last 3 years and continue to do so. And the one that really jumps off the page is culture. So it will come as no surprise that in 2016, we published the guide to managing culture and the tool and the toolkit that is available courtesy of QBE. 2 years on, we have already found it necessary to update that guide, and also with the benefit, not only the fact that culture and the practice of culture and culture risk has moved on, but also the benefit that people have now used that tool for 2 years. And we got a little bit of more feedback as to the experience of people using the tool. But 42% of people only 3 years ago said risk culture was not embedded within their organisation. When we go out and we talk to organisations through our members today, we find that figure is a much higher figure. And there have been a lot of reports produced, particularly by the FRC, and they produced a very interesting report on culture in 2016, as well as our own report in the same year. And there's been a huge focus on risk culture, not least of all because of its impact in the way that risk is managed in organisations and the success of that. The other subject that I wanted to pick up on there was also that risk management and risk education are not fully integrated with wider business units. Now, that is a moving feast. And even if we said, well, in 2015, we stepped back, we completely revised our education programme, what we're now finding in Airmic, and I know that Georgina is nodding vigorously next to me, we are constantly revisiting our education and technical programme, and that's not going to change, is it, Victoria?
Georgina? Definitely, Georgina.
Yeah.
No, we're constantly sort of making sure that our education programme responds to these sorts of concerns. I've got to admit, Julia, it's a bit of a depressing picture, this slide. I'm hoping that you're going to tell us something a little bit more positive.
Oh, definitely. But one of the reasons I went back and looked at this was really just to sense check myself how radically some of the things that we're focusing on have changed. And I found it quite hard to believe. And yeah, sure enough, 3 years ago, life looked a bit different. So then I'm going to set you an easier challenge, because I'm now only going to ask you to cast your minds back 1 year. And we did a deep dive survey in 2017 with the help of some of our partners who helped sponsor the production of a report with an organisation called Longitude, who are part of the Financial Times group. And as a result of that survey, we also fed into some questions that helped us fuel the production of 3 mini reports. One on digital transformation, which was a subject picked out by our sponsor Chubb. One on fitness of the insurance market for the future, which was picked out by our partner AXA Corporate Solutions. And the third, which was the value of risk and insurance management, which was picked out by our third sponsor and partner in this project, JLT. Now, for those of you who have got very good eyesight, you will notice when you open up the 2018 report, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, that we have asked each of those partners to go back and give a retrospective view on what's changed in the past year. I would point out to people on the webinar, those 3 mini reports are still very valid. And if you haven't done, please do take the chance to go onto the website and download them. They are all still there, and I think they're as fresh and relevant as they were 12 months ago. So the other subject I wanted to cover, which I mentioned briefly at the introduction, was the Roads to Revolution research, which we carried out concurrently with the survey in 2018. And the question we were asking in Roads to Revolution was, how are organisations transforming their business models to ensure resilience, value and growth in the digital age? This piece of research came up with 3 new principles of resilience, which was extremely interesting and is relevant to what we find in our own research. And in fact, again, I'll come on to a slide later on, which was designed in the survey this year, in the survey questionnaire, deliberately to fuel the research that we did on Roads to Revolution. Now, importantly, and I think this is vital when we add the research together, the research findings together with what came out of Roads to Revolution, is that there are 3 areas that we really do need to focus on, both as Airmic and as partners of Airmic and as members of Airmic. And these are 3 areas which now supplement the 5 principles of resilience which you'll find in Roads to Resilience. Now, this is not a presentation about resilience. So if you want to go back and have a look at what Roads to Resilience published in 2014, you'll find a very easy to read executive summary on the website. But there were 5 principles in that piece of work. Now, what our research this year showed us is that there are 3 additional principles, and they are very key to the way that organisations are going to be managed, and very important in terms of how those organisations are going to be risk managed. And those 3 new principles are reinvent purpose, retain stakeholders, and redesign process and products. Sounds really easy and really straightforward, but actually these are fundamental. Now, the first one, reinvent purpose, is key because what we discovered in the research and what our survey was actually reinforcing was that organisations are increasingly going to have to step back and challenge their purpose and what they exist for. Now, that's going to have enormous knock-on implications to the way that they manage risk. I'll give you a little example. Risk appetite, one of our favourite subjects. Many organisations produce a number of risk appetite statements. They review them annually with their board, and then they get the board to approve them, and job done. However, it's really important that organisations, if they're looking at repurposing, also relook at everything else that underpins that purpose. So, for example, if you are repurposing the reason your organisation exists, you also have to repurpose things like your risk appetite. Because if you don't do that, you could have the most amazing strategy and business plan that positions you well for the future, but then you have a risk appetite that's set at the wrong level to calibrate that redivision and resetting of your purpose. And what it could do is it could hold you back. It could create a lag or a drag on the way that you're going to do things, because your risk appetite might be too high or too low to support the purpose of what your organisation now says it wants to do.
So, Julia, looking at this resilience principle of reinventing purpose, and you've talked about risk appetite, and sort of that sounds almost like a slightly reactive role for the risk manager to play. Do you think that, I mean, looking at the principles in their essence, they're huge strategic changes for the business. Is there a role that's a little bit more proactive and forward-facing for the risk manager themselves?
Yes, there is, and in fact, that's a great question, Georgina, because this came out both in the survey of 2015 and in the survey this year, because it was encouraging the risk managers to get much more involved at the strategy setting and business model design stage rather than too far into the process. Now, again, incredibly easy thing to say, a very difficult thing to achieve, but I do think that because of the prominence of risk on the business agenda, and we will touch upon, as you would expect me to do, the new 2018 FRC code. So I will mention that in a moment, but that's saying that it's essential that risk is considered at the creation of strategy, at the creation of your business model. And if you then subsequently go on to redesign any of that following the purposing of your organisation, you really need to be considering risk at the outset. Right. And this is a challenge for risk managers, because they really do need to be in the strategy setting process, but also have the tools and techniques to be able to do that. So it's one thing to get involved in a meeting, it's quite another when somebody asks you a tricky question that you can't answer because you're likely to get your head shot off and not be asked again in the future. So there's some real ramifications in there for education for the risk manager. Get involved, but also you have to get involved and know what you're doing. The other two principles, which I'll touch on very briefly, of retained stakeholders, is saying that all through the repurposing process, stakeholders, whether they're your workforce, whether they're your customers, or whether they're your suppliers, have to be involved in the redesign process. And we found that companies who were becoming digitally successful were those organisations that, as they went along their repurposing, were doing a great job in engaging stakeholders. And of course, when they were redesigning their process and products, which are going to look very different in the digital future, where organisations start to combine change with developments in technology. Now, if risk management is going to be there when you're looking at change, and we keep saying the world is moving faster, it's more connected, it's more complicated, then that in essence has an effect on the way that risk is managed. It has an effect on the context in which it is managed. And certainly the risk manager has to have a very good knowledge of the business and how technology affects that business as it goes through that process. So there are some enormous ramifications for risk management in here. So this is just a very quick diagram, which I've added a couple of arrows just to point out where these additional three principles sit. And of course, you won't be disappointed to know that not only are there three new principles, but the existing principles have also been slightly modified, because nothing stays the same. So the 5 existing principles of risk radar, resource, having great networks, having rapid response, and being able to review and adapt are all still relevant, but they're a little bit more tricky than they were before. So, picking up your question, Georgina, with external and internal context, this is a clock with 3 hands on it. The outer hand and the outer circle is looking at the pace of the world. So it's almost, if you imagine it's a globe, and it's how the world is changing, which is an incredibly rapid pace. The blue circle in the middle is how organizations are changing. And typically what we're finding is that the organizations are changing at a slower rate than the world. And therefore there's a chance that organizations are increasingly going to find themselves lagging behind. In the middle, the orange one, if I was very clever at computer graphics,
it'll be spinning.
That would be spinning, and it would be a bit like a bowl of jelly, because that's oscillating and changing all the time and blurring. Now, if a world looks like that and a business looks like that, that's what risk looks like as well. So you're managing risk in a constantly speeding up environment, in an organization that's slow, but then you're also coping with blurring of risk, which makes it ever more important that risk is not managed in silos. Because if they're blurring into each other and they're being affected by the outside world and your organization, then you've got some additional challenges. So if I just finish off this little bit about the revolution, because I really do want to get on to the survey itself. And these are a couple of slides. For those of you who have been bored by me on this before, you've seen these slides before. Normally, it's a castle at this stage. And actually, the two slides are now the same, because one of the things we're picking up from the research, and one of the things we've picked up from Roads to Revolution, is that organizations are either pre-crisis or in crisis. And the days of actually having a period of time when you were sat in your Dover castle, which is an image we used to use before, have gone. And either you're in a glass house like this with the lights on or off, but you're in a glass house all the time. Now, if you don't think that's the case, go and have a quick chat with people at Facebook. Go and have a quick chat, you know, if you want to go back a little bit further and talk to the people at TalkTalk. This is the type of situation that they faced then and that they now live and work with on a permanent basis. And part of the reason for this is the speed at which the world is turning, but it's also partly the speed at which crisis happens and emerges. And often your customers and those stakeholders that we talked about that are so important in resilience know that you've had a problem before you know yourself. And the first time you might see about it is on Facebook or on another form of social media. So again, the world has changed.
Yeah, Julia, before we move on to the survey itself, we've had one comment from one of our listeners saying that they sort of think the sort of effective risk management should really be sort of spotting and suggesting that the firm's business purpose is not aligned to the market. And it should also be providing the decision support that understands the benefits and risks of changing or adapting purpose in line with the changing environment. Would you agree with that?
Well, partly. Because my first answer to that would be what market? Because if you're repurposing, you may decide actually that part of your repurposing leads you to decide that you want to be in a different market and not the market that you were in before, or that you're going to approach the market in a very different way. If the dynamics of the market have changed, you may decide it's somewhere you don't want to be anymore, but you still want to be a business. So I do think the risk management team have a role to play in that process. I also think, should it also provide the decision support that understands the benefits and risks of changing? Absolutely. And that's a very grown-up thing to do, because it means you've got to be right in the middle of the business. You've got to understand how the strategy is created. And I think one of the biggest challenges of all is to get yourself invited in through the door to the process. Definitely. And I think that will come with a maturity where risk managers become more business partners than purely looking at buying insurance or managing risk. Absolutely. Because risk management, and what we were listening to from the survey, is very much these days more about business partnering. And by the way, if you thought it was something you could put away to one side, walking the roads to revolution is not optional. We can't hope that we put our heads in the sand and it will go away. It's part of the future existence. And therefore, risk managers, as with other business leaders, have to get used to the language. They have to learn what it means. And I would almost say that technology becomes the new finance. So you have to have the technical skills, you have to have the financial skills, and you now also have to have the technical skills as well, technology skills. Not so that you suddenly become the CIO or the CISO, but also that you can talk their language and collaborate with them as part of the business team to be that business partner. And if that was not enough, for those of you who've had the opportunity to look at the new 2018 FRC code, we're thrilled at Airmic because we think quite a lot of what we said in the review process has been listened to by the FRC. And we did make the point to Stephen Haddrell, both in writing and when he gave our Airmic lecture earlier this year, that we really felt it was time that governance and the standards that boards look towards to help them have effective corporate governance look more towards the future and not the legacy of the past. And when you get a chance to look at the code, you'll see the prominence that is given to emerging risk as well as principal risks. And we like to think that maybe we got listened to there, where we were saying, if organisations are going to be fast forwarding, you can't always look over your shoulder and look at principal risks, which do tend, not always, but do tend to be more of a legacy effect because they're based on analysis of what you know. So big challenge for the board, which means, again, they're going to be looking to people like the risk management professionals to help them get higher scrutiny, to help them verify the data, not just look at it, to help them recognise those broader stakeholder interests. There's the Roads to Revolution 3 points again. And to make sure that they get stakeholder input, including risk managers, into strategy decisions. You could say that's actually quite a different type of board for the future, as well as a different type of risk management professional for the future. And then the point about moving away from legacy. So the 2018 survey we called Embracing Change. So it's not that change is coming and the future is nigh, the future is now was the subject of the 2018 Airmic conference, and it was all about embracing change. Now this is a profile that you can see in the survey report, which is online, that shows you what the journeys are that people have taken to get to become risk managers. And it's quite varied. If you go back to that 2015 and pre-2015 world, we have far more people who come up purely through an insurance route. What we're starting to see, and I think there are a couple of drivers there, is that you're starting to see people with other professional backgrounds coming into the risk management space and now typically making up part of the matrix of what is an Airmic member. And we have more people with finance backgrounds, project backgrounds, audit. I've seen increase. I think if we did the survey today, that would be more than 8%, probably nearer 10 or 11. So insurance still incredibly important. It's a great foundation for managing risk, which is why we promote the two subjects together. But there is a differing journey, and still we see that younger age profile and higher academic qualification, as we now have over 200 university courses offering a combination of risk or insurance.
And Julia, are you sort of, if you go back onto the slide of the journeys, would you sort of be seeing that there is a distinct split between whether that journey will take you into an insurance buying role or into a sort of broader enterprise risk management role, or are they more merging?
I think it's a bit like people are in a tumble dryer. Okay. And the internal audit profession saw this a few years ago, actually, that they had a bit of a problem, actually, because people were churning through the profession, and they were struggling, actually, to have people who've been internal audit professionals for any length of time. And they were almost encouraged after 2 or 3 years to go off and do something else. The internal audit profession's taken a bit of a turn on that and have now said, actually, we do want to keep professionals who are professional auditors. And I think the same is true in the risk and insurance space. But one of the reasons we open up Fast Track, for example, to our partners to attend, as well as our members, is that inevitably somewhere down the track, it's quite likely that people will change role, and they'll end up managing risk or insurance as a broker or an insurer or with a corporate, and indeed in some cases go backwards and forwards between the two more than once. So we do think it will change. We do think it's a sign of the times, and we're moving with the times. And I think we've seen that particularly in Fast Track, and actually also at the other end of the education journey, where we've just asked our partners, you know, do you have people who'd like to be in the CAS risk leadership program? Because that's actually not about being technical and going out and buying insurance or managing risk. It's actually strategy and leadership. Why don't we learn about those things together? And there's a lot to be said for that. So again, it's all about being business partners and learning together. We've started to dip our toe in the water about gender and pay bands. And I wouldn't want to read too much into this information other than it mirrors very, very closely what we've seen with much bigger statistical segments. And in effect, we're saying that we've got more younger women paid less in the risk management profession. And if we're being honest and open with ourselves, that's pretty much what it looks like in the insurance industry as well. Very interesting to observe. What are we doing about it? Well, we're doing a few things actually. And I've been working with a couple of our partners and with colleagues like Sian Fisher, who's the Chief Executive of the Chartered Insurance Institute, and a number of our members. And all I would say to you at this stage is watch this space, because we will be announcing some work that we're doing on diversity. We're going to start with gender, because you can't do everything all at the same time. But I've met up with a couple of partners and with the CII, and we have some great ideas about what we can actually do to make some changes rather than keep observing them. So this is a toe in the water and not much more at this stage.
Sort of going back to the types of role, we've had a comment of saying sort of interesting to note that there's sort of no operators, perhaps no sort of operational risk managers in there. You know, why do you think that is, or is that maybe the way the question was asked?
In terms of the respondents, I think it's partly in the question. I think operational risk management also is, you know, I used to manage operational risk myself in financial institutions, so it means different things to different people. But this is the journey that people have taken, not what they're currently doing. So we could do another session which actually says, what do you do now? And if you split what people do now, there's a much bigger emphasis on risk than perhaps in previous reports than there was. So if I split the membership, we've got about 25% of members are insurance buyers. We have about 50% who buy insurance and manage risk in an integrated way, and 25% who only manage risk and have nothing to do with the insurance program. And I would suggest that in that combined role and in the risk role, you will find that there are people who are operational risk managers, either using the financial institutions definition, which is a little bit more about process, or in the wider definition, which would involve things like business continuity, security, health and safety, etc. So they're there. And maybe next year when we do the survey, we can ask some more specific questions. But we'd have to define what we mean by operational risk, because it's different things to different people. It wouldn't be a survey about risk without asking this question. I only put the top 5 challenges on here. You can. There are more if you want to look at the report itself. But the reason I put this one in is to show the increasing presence that cyber has in the agenda. Reputation and brand value, whether you call it a risk or whether you don't, we could have a whole webinar on that subject. But nevertheless, a lot of people do put it down as a concern, and it's still up there, and it's still got about 40% of the share, and it's still holding steady in about 3 years' time at that sort of level. But look at cyber event causing business interruption, which is almost at the same level now as reputation, and actually is scheduled in the next 3 years to overtake it. And in fact, the next risk as well, which is more along the lines of damage or theft of personal data, probably fueled in part by awareness of GDPR, is also creeping up. So if you add those two together, it's actually a clear number 1 at the moment. I would still say to you that if you actually started looking at some organisations, and including UK government here, about what keeps them awake at night, they actually put disease at the top of the list, not cyber. And that gives one explanation as to why our ERM forum in November has got Jeremy Farrar from the Wellcome Trust talking about disease management. So very important subject, but it doesn't tend to make it up onto the top. Look at the last one on that list, just want to linger a second there. competitors using new technologies and business models threaten market share. That's the link and the synergy with repurposing. So if you don't repurpose when people are threatening your share, you're going to keep losing that market share. So that's considered to be fairly important now, but more important in a few years. So I'm going to take about another 5 minutes to finish going through that, if you can bear with me, because we've got quite a lot of information to cover. So if you can do that, thank you. This was a specific question that we put into the survey, which helped us fuel some of the research into roads to revolution. That's my point about there's a synergy between the two. What bothers me a little bit here is the low level of great confidence of our members and emerging technology risk. So people who are very confident, and confident is actually quite low on those specific areas of cloud computing through to Internet of Things that we specifically asked people to comment on. And if I'm honest, I think those figures are probably still quite high as well. They're probably, maybe, if we're true to ourselves, a bit lower than that. The don't know is a bit concerning as well, because in a couple of cases, the don't know is almost as high as those who feel very confident or confident. And the somewhat in the middle. That tells me that Airmic has some things to do to look at our education and technical programs to make sure that we're covering technology issues as much as we should do, and particularly emerging technology. And I'll come on in a second with some answers of what we're going to do. I'm not going to linger on this one because I think as we're limited for time, I just would rather use pictures rather than too many words. And this one really, again, picks up what people told us in the survey is, again, very sympathetic with what we found in Roads to Revolution, which was not based just on what members told us. So there is some very common understanding, and that is the blurring of functional accountabilities. You know, in a world which is complex, integrated and fast moving, you can't manage risk in silos. It just can't be done. So it's really driving an enterprise approach to managing risk. And I think the other one that sort of bothered me there is the one with on the right hand side, which our risk professionals, however, said that don't worry guys, technology won't let us down and it will bail us out. And I think when we talked to Cass Business School about that answer to that question, they were really quite bothered about that, because they said, well, if you don't understand the technology and you don't understand how it works, it's a bit like, I don't know, when you were at school, it was probably calculators. When I was at school, we used slide rules and logarithmic tables. But if you don't understand how the math works, definitely, it's very difficult. And that goes back to the board as well. You cannot just rely in a board on what the stats say. You've actually got to understand where they came from and how those statistics have been worked out. It doesn't mean that you've got to be a statistician, but it does mean that you've got to understand the source. So connected risks need connected answers. You can't work in a silo, and surprise, surprise, it's a basic principle of enterprise risk management. And we hear a lot about risk connectivity, but actually that's all that risk connectivity is primarily about. Then just to bring to a conclusion, we asked a lot of questions in the 2015 survey about broker transparency, and broker trust. And this year, with the support of a couple of our brokers, we designed some questions that re-asked that scenario as to whether or not things had changed, and did members feel as mistrustful as perhaps they indicated they did in 2015. Now, life is not perfect. We can see that from the results, but actually
it's not as bad as I thought.
I think they're better, aren't they? Than...
Certainly better than when we asked the questions, as you say, a couple of years ago. Mixed picture, but generally a sort of positive trend. People do have faith in their broker, and that they're sort of having their best interests at heart and so on.
Do you know the thing that sort of cheered me the most was that brokers asked us to do this?
Yes. Yes.
We didn't go to the brokers saying this is what we think you should do. They actually came to us and said we'd like to know. So I thought that was a big improvement on perhaps a situation that we had 3 years ago, although we still got place to go.
Yes.
There's things that we've still got to improve for sure. And there's a little bit there about what people have said they're going to be doing. Now we had a round table with Lloyd's. Was it last week? It was only last week, wasn't it? Seems longer ago, but this sort of features very much what we heard at that round table with some of our members about the value of solutions that might be bundled that you can purchase through your insurer. And you can see today 28%, 40% said they were going to use that more within 3 years. Fewer people using standalone insurance. Insurance, those therefore with bundled solutions like media and legal support. Insurance-linked securities being considered more than currently. Less by way of self-insured pooling type arrangements, but the good old captive is alive and well.
Definitely growing.
People keep telling me that no, captives are, you know, not something that we think will grow, but actually that's telling us that they're not meteoric, but actually people that use them are finding innovative ways to continue to do so as part of their risk financing. So we're going to be taking that away and doing more work on that this year. So in conclusion, what does that mean to the modern risk professional? It's all great stuff, but what does it mean? Well, we've got to be more strategic. We have got to be those business partners. We've got to make sure that strategy, tactics and operations, we play a role in helping the jelly mold in the 3 clock model. And we cannot believe that digital technologies will just give all the answers. You have to actually understand how the slide rule works. To use an expression which my children would say, what's a slide rule? But we'll talk about that later. So what we're doing in Airmic is that in response to what the survey told us and what Roads to Revolution told us, we're running more roundtables, more opportunities to talk to people face to face on specific subjects, more lectures. It won't have slipped your notice. It certainly didn't slip mine and Georgina's that we've issued a lot of publications and newsletters. And we're going to be running some boot camps. So we're going to be running our first boot camp for about half a dozen risk managers on analytics. And I'm working with a couple of analytics companies at the moment to run a 4 or 5 day intensive program. I can't imagine we would have done that 2 or 3 years ago, where people were insurance buyers. They're now being required to be much more data managers and analytics managers. And you need to go through a transition to be able to do that. Airmic Academy, we're going to stick with Airmic Academy. We're still going to have essentials and hot topics and webinars like today, but we're going to do some deep dive academy days. And the first one, being true to what we've been talking about today, is a technology academy day, 13th of September. For anyone online who wants to come along, it's a free full day of thought leadership and debate, which we're going to hold at the Aviva Digital Garage, I think it is.
Yes, in Hoxton, so just outside of the city.
Come along. It promises to be a fantastic day. We've got some great keynote speakers, really boxing above its weight, actually. We've got people I might normally expect to see at the annual conference. So please, if you're free that day, let us know and book your place.
And I'd add that sort of in line with Julia's sort of discussions about getting sort of deeper into the business and all about in sort of focusing on collaboration, risk managers are invited to bring sort of members of their IT function or their chief information security officer along to that event. We're making sure that is an event that does, of course, touch on the relevance of insurance in this digital technological age, but also focusing more on what that means for business and for risk in general.
Well, if you're going to be a business partner, you've got to collaborate.
Exactly.
And the deep dives that we're going to do, starting with technology, but we've got 4 others in mind over the next 12 months, is living proof that we're listening to what our members say and providing education which we think is aimed at making them fit for the future. And last but not least is if we've been very good. We don't survey our members too much these days, but we are going to be doing a deep dive survey again in 2018, and we'll be doing that and publishing the results with new mini reports through new partners at the 2019 Airmic conference. So everybody, thank you very much for dialing in today. Thank you for giving up your time. Thank you very much for doing that. If any of you would like to pursue any of the questions that you've answered or any of the subject that we've covered today, drop me a line on an email and I'm very happy to provide an answer for you in greater detail. So thank you for dialing in. We are going to be running another webinar, but that webinar will be run with the people who produced the mini reports last year. So we've asked them to give their reflections on what has changed. So watch this space. We will be addressing those mini reports in a subsequent webinar. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.